Well, good morning and welcome to worship here at the United Methodist Church of Johnstown. It is great and glorious to see you all. My name is Jeremy Scott. I am the pastor and chief joy officer in this place, and it really is my joy to be with you. Today we're doing our second week as we talk about this really important topic of forgiveness. And you remember last week we talked about the fact that really forgiveness is sort of this cornerstone concept and idea that we have to wrestle with and deal with as people of faith. It's something that Jesus sort of put in the center of what it is that we do. And in a bit here, we're going to pray the Lord's Prayer again, as we do every Sunday, and you'll be reminded it has a call in there for us to forgive as we have been forgiven. So today we're going to talk, last week we talked a little about kind of what forgiveness isn't. It's not about forgetting, and it's not about continually putting yourself in a situation where those, where folks can harm you. It's not about that. So today we're going to actually talk about, well, what then is forgiveness? And then more importantly, how do we practice it? Right? Forgiveness really is a verb. And in the church, we treat it as such. We deal with the fact that we have received an amazing gift from God. We receive this gift of forgiveness, and we repay that gift of forgiveness by forgiving others. So what does that look like, and how do we actually do that, and how do we do that well? So that's actually what we're going to be spending the next 3 weeks on. We're going to start today talking about, well, what is it then? If it's not forgetting, then what is it? So that's what we're going to deal with, because we all have things that we probably need to forgive, and we all have things that we probably need forgiveness for. That's kind of the universal human condition. And God knows that. So God gave us some really important guidance on how to do that well. So that's what we're going to talk about. I'm excited you're all here. All right. Now, though, I'm going to invite you to actually stand yet again as we join in our call to worship.
Good morning.
Morning, all.
Well, howdy. Hey there, Pete. Long time no see. What's keeping your tail wagging?
Oh, not much. I'm just on my way to my swimming lessons.
Isn't it getting a little cold for swimming?
Oh, we ducks swim all year. That's why we have built-in down coats.
Oh, well, okay then, but you can't swim with that on, can you?
With what?
The big, heavy shoe you're carrying? That will make swimming really hard, won't it?
Oh, this. Well, yeah, it actually makes a lot of things harder. Even just walking up the hill, I am dog tired. Sorry, Betsy. You don't look tired. You look great.
It's okay, I understand. I'm just not catching your scent, though. If that thing's just weighing you down, why don't you stop carrying it around?
Well, it's just not that easy.
Why not?
Because someone gave it to me. Threw it at me, really.
Threw it at you?
Yeah, it was just last week. I was walking down the street and I stepped on this guy's foot. And I said I was sorry, but he got all mad and he threw this at me.
Wow, that wasn't very nice of him at all. Sorry, buddy. I don't understand why you're still hauling it around, though.
Because carrying it around reminds me of what happened. And if I ever see that guy again, I want to have it so I can toss it right back at him.
Wow, Peep. That doesn't sound very forgiving.
Why should I have to forgive him? He should be forgiving me.
Maybe, but how much work are you doing carrying that thing around all the time? And even if you see him again, what happens next? You think he'll just walk away after you throw it at him?
Well, I really didn't think about all that. I just thought it'd make me feel better, to get even.
Sounds like you'll end up chasing your tail. Trust me, that doesn't end well.
Well, then what should I do?
Well, to start with, I think you should put that thing down.
Well, if I put it down, what happens if I see that guy again?
Instead of trying to hurt each other, maybe you could try explaining how you feel. Or if you don't feel safe doing that, maybe the best thing is just walk the other way.
But if I do that, he won't know how mad I am.
Well, maybe by then you won't actually be mad anymore. There are more important things in life than staying mad or getting even. You know, like swimming lessons.
Well, you kind of pinned the tail on the donkey there, my friend. I do love swimming, and this thing makes it really hard. To say nothing of my flying lessons. I think you're right. I'm just gonna put this down.
Oh, now, how does that feel?
You know, I actually feel a little lighter, but my wing is really sore.
I bet. Give it some time. I bet that'll feel better too.
All right. Thanks, friends.
No problem, buddy. Glad to lighten your load.
Hey, you two. You think we should all say a quick prayer before Peep heads off to the swimming hole? What do you think, kids? Will you pray with us?
That sounds good. Can
Let's
you
bow
guys
our
pray?
heads. Good morning, God.
Good morning, God.
Thank you for teaching us about forgiveness.
Thank you for teaching us about forgiveness.
Help us to remember
Help us to remember
that forgiving people,
that forgiving people,
even if they don't deserve it,
even if they don't deserve it,
will make our lives better.
will make our lives better.
Amen.
Amen.
Have fun, you guys.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.
Show me how to love the unlovable. Show me how to reach the unreachable. Help me now to do the impossible. Forgiveness, I want to finally set it free. So show me how to see what your mercy sees. Help me now to give what you gave to me. Forgiveness. 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 Forgiveness.
All right. We're going to talk about, obviously, forgiveness is what we are talking about as part of this. And today we're going to talk about this idea of forgiving our neighbor. And what does it mean to forgive somebody else, and why is that important? And we're going to start with something that that really usually isn't my style. I like sports. I'm not really a sports guy, but I do like sports. But if you're a sports person, I want you to think about something. I want you to think about the last really great play you saw somebody do or perform in whatever your chosen sport is, and kind of think about that for a minute. All right. And then I want you to think about what was the last really bad call you saw a ref or an umpire make. Right? Think about that for a minute. My guess is for a lot of us, the second one is actually easier to remember than the first one, right? Right? Great plays are wonderful and they're great and all of that, but it's the bad calls that keep coming up. Right? Because I've noticed this, whenever you watch a football game, and they'll talk about the last time this team met and whatever happened, or the game happened last week. If there was a questionable call by the referees, either in the last time this team played or in the last game they played, it will get brought up. Right? We do not let this stuff go. It'll be news, and all that. And the reason is because we want things to be fair. Right? We do. We want things to be fair. And I find it really interesting that we raise our children and remind them over and over and over again that life isn't fair, right? And if you have multiple kids, you know this. Why does Sally get to do what I didn't get to do? And because life isn't fair, and go to bed, right? We drill this into the heads of our children, and then we become adults, and we suddenly think that, well, wait a minute, maybe life should be fair. But it's not. I hate to burst your bubble. It's not fair. And so, but because we want it to be fair, we basically invent ways to keep score. We really do. We do this all the time. I do this. Well, maybe you don't because you're a better person than I am, but I do this all the time. And I realized this just the other day. I was going into Denver for a meeting, and so of course that means you got to deal with I-25 and the traffic and, all those sorts of things. And of course, one of the things that I always struggle with is, which lane to get in, right? Like, I'm going pretty far, so I should kind of be over here, but this one seems to be moving faster. And almost without thinking about it, what I will do, if I pick one lane over another, I will mentally note where the car next to me is. And I win if I get where I'm going before they do, right? And if they pass me, then we've got a problem. And if I pass them, I kind of smile. And you're all smiling. Some of you are smiling like, you know this game, right? And because frankly, we all kind of do it. In the world of like retail and thinking about retail, there's actually this phenomenon called line envy, right? Where you get in one line thinking it's going to be the shortest line, and then you notice 2 lines down that line got through before you did, and now you're all sad, right? Because you lost. That other person in the car next to you or the person in the line next to you doesn't even know they're playing a game with you. But you know, and if you won, you feel good, right? And this is what we do. We do this all the time. We have a million ways to keep score, in big ways and little ways and all that sort of stuff. Because I think instinctively we sort of want things to be fair. But we also know at the same time that they're not. And while it may seem kind of harmless or maybe something kind of fun to do, while you're driving in a car, what happens is if we go down that path too far, we end up building up animosity. We start building up resentment against people that does not serve them and does not serve us. So one of the first things we have to reconcile when we talk about forgiveness is forgiveness isn't about fairness either. It's not about making things fair or dealing, but it's actually forgiveness is decidedly unfair. And that's the point that Jesus is trying to make in the story today. Jesus has all these people around him, and he's kind of talking about all this crazy stuff. And one of the things he's talking about is our call to forgive. And the way that Jesus asks us to practice forgiveness is fairly radical. I think it's honestly every bit as radical today as it was 2,000 years ago, but it was definitely radical 2,000 years ago as well, because Jesus is part of a tradition where there are rules for things, and if you follow the rules and you do everything you're supposed to do, then that means you're a good person, and if you don't follow the rules, that means you're not. And Jesus says, no, because that's just a way of keeping score, and it's not about that. And one of the primary things that Jesus wants us to know is that God's not keeping score with us in that way. That's not what all of this is about. And he wants to make that point plain, so he tells this story, because Jesus loves to tell stories. So he tells this story about a lord, about a king, and the slaves that the king had. Now, this would have been fairly well known to people of the day. Like, we kind of struggle with stories like that because we don't live in a world with lords and kings and slaves and servants and everything in the way that they did. For them, this was every day, right? They knew exactly. When you say there was a lord, most people, unless you happened to be a lord yourself, most people had one. Right? You probably worked on their land. There was so much about you was defined not just by who you were, but who your Lord was. And most people today would have had somebody like that. So when he said there is a Lord, everybody's head would automatically go to the Lord or the king or whoever it is that they were subject to. Again, this is kind of weird for us because that's not the world that we live in, but it was that was Jesus' time. So Jesus tells this story about this Lord and this servant or slave, and gets in debt into the Lord, which again was a common thing. There are no banks back then, right? Like, you can't just break out your American Express card, right? MasterCard hasn't been existed yet. Nothing is priceless, right? So if you need something, if you need to borrow money, you have to go to a rich person to borrow it, and chances are the one you're going to go to is the one that is your king or your lord. So there's this slave, and he goes, and he owes all of this money to his master. Now, it says, I think, different translations translate it differently, so many talents or so many denarii or, whatever it is. And since we don't know the exchange rate of dollars to talents. Another thing that might be lost on us, if we were going to do a modern translation, you may say there was a slave and he owed his master $1 jillion, right? I mean, that's basically what Jesus is saying. This is a made-up, fictitious number that represents something like 1,500 years of the average person's wages. Right? It's an unknowable, you're like, how did you spend all of that? Like, what did you spend that money on? But basically, what Jesus is saying, there was this guy, and this guy owned his master a sum of money that could never be realistically repaid. He owed an amount that could never be realistically repaid. And then this moment happens between them, where the Lord calls together everybody and says, hey, you kind of owe me all this stuff. And of course, the servant does what he does, and he pleads for his life. And he's like, just give me some more time. Now, the Lord doesn't have to do this. He's completely within his rights to recover whatever he can recover. That would be the expected practice of the day, right? Taking everything the person has, selling it off, selling him off, because again, this is a day where, again, not our world, their world. And he's completely within his rights to do all of that. He would be being generous. The generous response from the Lord at the time, the unexpected response of the Lord at the time, would be to say, okay, you can have some more time. Maybe in saying, you can have some more time, and I won't run up the interest on you, right? Like while you're having your more time. That would be an incredibly gracious response that would be unexpected even in that time and place. And yet this king does something really, really crazy. He not only says, okay, I'm not going to take all your stuff, and I'm not going to sell you to somebody else, but I'm not only going to give you more time, I'm going to erase what you owe. I'm going to forget about it. And you can just go on, and you don't have to worry about this debt to me anymore. How transformational in the life of that servant to not have this thing hanging over your head, to not have all the worry and the guilt and everything that must come with having that kind of debt held over you. How amazing he must feel, how much lighter must he feel after this. But then, of course, we read and the story goes, right? So the Lord has this giant book with all the debts in it, and he basically closes the book and says, we're not going to deal with that. You're forgiven. And then the servant leaves. And he's happy and he's grateful and he lives happily ever after. No. If you were paying attention at all to the reading, he does not, right? What does he do? The first thing he does is he finds the person who owes him some money. Does everything that he is completely in his rights to do. He's in his rights to put him in prison. He's in his rights to do everything he does. But basically, goes and finds that person and says, you know what, you owe me. I don't know why I'm pointing at you, John, but sure. You don't owe me anything, I promise. And he does. So he does. And he basically, and he's totally within his rights to do it. Except that he and his fellow slaves and everyone else around him knows, wait a minute, weren't you the one that was just forgiven of this big, big thing you could never hope to pay back? And here you are a few moments later? Didn't the king close his book of debts on you? And here you are clutching yours? We all receive this tremendous gift of forgiveness from God. A tremendous gift that we could not possibly pay back. And our call really isn't to try to pay God back. Our call is to pay it forward to everybody around us. We forgive, and we forgive our neighbors first and foremost because we have been forgiven. And truthfully, we can't really say we've been forgiven, and we can't really live into that forgiveness, and we can't really claim that forgiveness if we aren't willing to share and show that forgiveness to others. That's what Jesus is on about here. So the question is, how do you do that? Like, how do you do that? Because many of us carry around a lot of stuff. And sometimes it's really big stuff. Sometimes something really tragic happened to us. Sometimes it's a lot of little things. There's that person that just really, really annoys us, right? And they're probably not going to change. You all thought about somebody at your office or at school or not at church, because we're all great here. We never annoy each other. Right? Right? We all carry around kind of this low level, need to forgive. Sometimes it's big stuff. Sometimes it's a lot of little stuff. Well, how do we do that? How do we do that? All right, so I'm going to give you a quick rundown on a framework for how you do that. So this is where your engineering side of your pastor is coming out. So, because I love a good framework. Right? And it's really similar. It's called we use the 4 C's. Now, I did not invent this. I wrote a note about it. I can't remember where it came from. I Googled it. I don't know who I need to give credit to, but this is not an original Jeremy Scott idea, but I really, really liked it, and preachers steal stuff. And we're unrepentant. All right. So there's these things called the 4 C's, and the first C is curious. So what does this look like? Oftentimes, forgiveness is about letting go of anger, right? Forgiveness is about somebody did something to me and I'm angry about it and I have a choice. I can either hold on to it or I can let it go. And the process of letting go of that anger is what we call forgiveness. So somebody does something and it drives us a little bit or a lot crazy. We can get mad at them. Or the other option is we can get curious about maybe why is that person that way? And I don't mean, why is that person that way? No. I mean, a sincere, what is going on? How can I understand what's going on in that person's life that leads them to be this way? Right? And so I was thinking about this, and I have all sorts of stories. But one of the things that in my previous life, I used to work with a lot of clergy. So not in my previous appointment, I used to work with a lot of clergy who were doing intentional work in their church. Some of them were starting new churches. Somebody were trying to, revitalize existing churches, whatever it is. I worked with all these clergy. I discovered that there were a lot of them that would just annoy me. Because we would talk about stuff, and I'm like, well, why aren't you doing that, right? Like we do some stuff, and we talk, and we get back together, and I'm like, well, how did that go? And they're like, well, I didn't really have time, or, I didn't try, or this thing is happening, and that thing is happening. And sometimes I would get mad. I was like, what are we doing here? What's going on? And I felt that over time. And then what I realized is that that I was using my life and my experience and what it's like for me to be clergy, and not really thinking about what it was like for them. And when I thought about it, there were 2 things that came up for me. There are a lot of clergy who have part-time appointments, which means they have one job and then they do another job. They're a clergy, but they also have another job. They don't work full-time in the way that I am blessed to get to work full-time doing this. And what I had to recognize, and this seems fairly obvious, but I kind of forgot about it for a while, is that if you have another job, you only have so much time, right? Right? And so when I started to look through my list of those who I'm kind of like, oh, I'm struggling with these folks, I would look through this list and I'd be like, oh, right? They have other jobs. They have other responsibilities. They don't have as much time to do the things that I had when I was in a similar position as they had. So we're going to need to make some adjustments here. We're going to have to adjust expectations. We're going to have to change some stuff. We're going to have to adjust some expectations for the church or whatever it is, right? So instead of just getting mad or angry at them, curiosity led me to a place to go, oh, there's another way to handle it. The other thing that I discovered in working with all these clergy is, and this will be a surprise, I'm sure, to many of you, is that female clergy are treated differently than male clergy. And as a male clergy person, I can't use my experiences to determine what's going to happen for my female colleagues. I know, like, everyone's smiling at me like, you're an idiot. And I'm like, I know. And actually, I'm slightly embarrassed. The thing that actually brought this to my perspective was this amazing story in this podcast that I listened to about a guy and his experiences being a male nurse. And he had all these crazy stories about patients who would come to him and literally, like, you know, some of them refused to be treated or refused to be cared for by a male nurse because it was just so outside of their experience. And these conversations he had to have over and over and over again with people that his female colleagues never had to have because female nurses are normal. And something that people expect. And the truth is, we still live in a world where people do sort of expect pastors to be men, though by no means is that true. And so I realized, like, I would try to give advice to these people. I would try to give advice and work with some of my colleagues, but then realized, like, oh, your congregation, when you say that, like, I could say that. I could say it that way. And they would hear it one way. When you say it, because you're saying it as a woman, they're hearing it differently. So we kind of have to adjust what's going on. Curiosity is a powerful tool. And if we can allow ourselves to get curious before we get angry, to ask ourselves the question, I wonder why this is going on. I wonder what's going on in that person's life. I wonder why they are the way that they are. I wonder what's going on at home. I wonder what they're struggling with. I wonder what's in their background. I wonder what this is. I had many people throughout. No, I'm not gonna tell the story. Never mind. All right, because we got to move on. All right, we got time. All right. So curiosity is the first C, and it's a powerful tool, and it allows us to kind of take a step back and go, all right, what's going on here? What are the dynamics at play? Is it just that this person is just a total jerk, right? Or is there a reason? Is there something going on in their lives? And the curiosity sometimes will lead to the second C, which is compassion. And I think compassion is probably the thing that we are suffering from a lack of in our society as a whole right now than anything else. And because compassion is the ability really to put ourselves in the place of another person, to really identify with the struggles and what's going on in their lives, right? Now, compassion isn't about forgiving bad behavior, and the same way curiosity isn't. Right? This isn't about just saying, okay, that's not really a big deal if it is actually a big deal. But it's about trying to get at the underlying stuff behind it so that we can actually do something helpful and constructive. Right? And so compassion lets us do that. Compassion lets us be in another person's space as best we can and try to sympathize with what they're going on with them. Right? In this way, in many ways, the king had compassion on the slave. The slave, in turn, did not have compassion for his fellow people, right? So compassion is what lets us do that. And another story. When I was, again, in my last appointment, I also had to create a bunch of materials. I wrote and did stuff, and I know you're all very surprised. But I created a lot of materials, and there was another person who worked in the conference with me, and we were going through all the stuff once, and I showed her something that I had made, and I was excited about it, and she was mad, like really, really mad that I had made this thing. And I'm like, whoa, what's going on here, right? And of course, when somebody gets angry with you, the first thing you want to do is be defensive, right? And kind of get angry back. You're like, what are you talking about? Like, this is my job. I make stuff all the time. So I made this thing. And she's like, no. And it kind of turned into this. I'm like, whoa, what's going on? And what I kind of had failed to account for is, in this particular area, I was really straying kind of out of my world and into hers. Right? I was kind of straying kind of a little bit out of my job and into her job, right? Which would have been on the whole okay, except that I didn't tell her I was doing it. I didn't give her the opportunity to collaborate on it. And she was getting pressure from other places to do some of the very stuff that I had done. And so, what I had thought, like, here's this cool thing that now we can both use, she's like, no, you didn't invite me. We didn't get to collaborate on it. It kind of looks like you're taking over. And I'm like, oh, wasn't my intent, wasn't what I wanted to do. And I could see in that moment that she had a point. Now, I don't think she 100% had a point, and I think there were some places, and it doesn't mean that everything in her reaction was 100% okay, by no means. But when I put myself into her position and realized the pressures that she was under and what she was going on in her life and what was going on for her professionally and where she wanted to go and what she wanted to do, and that I really had just stepped on her toes in a big way, right? Compassion led me to a place where I'm like, okay, I get that. Like, how do we make this better? How do we do this together? How do we make this something that we can both use and celebrate and enjoy and compassion? Next one is C, is courage. The truth is, some situations are actually dangerous. The truth is, sometimes we don't know what's going to happen when we try to practice our forgiveness. Sometimes we don't know what dangers lie there. And sometimes they're small and personal, and we want to talk to this person, but we don't know how that conversation is going to go. We've all had those people in our lives that we're estranged from, and we want to forgive and we want to reconcile, but we're not even sure if they're going to take our phone call, right? And so even just picking up the phone or sending them an email or a Facebook message or whatever it is an act of courage, right? And we have to be willing to take the risk that both we may make the situation worse. The other thing, now, one of the places that this comes up, and I know I've talked about this before, but it's still a story I'm so amazed with that I want to just keep telling it, is in actually a big way, is in the work that the United Methodist Church and the pastors on the ground are doing in Eastern Angola. And I know we've talked about this. Eastern Angola was part of a massive civil war for years, and went on for about 20 years, and really only ended because people got tired of fighting, right? It didn't really ever end. So what that meant was there were still groups, very defined groups of people. And one of the big defined groups of people was there was the people who lived in the villages, and there was the people who kind of lived out in the wilderness. And they were most of the time, they were on very different sides in the conflict. And nothing was reconciled, and forgiveness between them seemed almost impossible. So one of the tasks that pastors and lay leaders of local churches would do, the churches were mostly in the villages. One of the things they realized is, like, if this is going to be reconciled, we can't just simply wait for them to come to us. We have to go to them, even though we don't know what that looks like, even though we don't know how we're going to be greeted, even though everybody's still very heavily armed, even though Angola is still the second highest land-mined country in the world, next to South Korea. And so that's what they did. They left the safety and the comfort of the village with the people that they knew, and they went out to find the people that they didn't, and offer and ask for the forgiveness that both sides needed, because both sides had done terrible things to the other. And if something was going to happen, if things were going to be different moving forward, somebody had to have the courage to go first. And it was the pastor and their lay leader and the church people, sometimes escorted by UN peacekeepers, are the ones that carried the message of grace and forgiveness out of the safety of their home into a world that they didn't know as well. Forgiveness requires courage. It requires taking a risk, not an undue risk. It doesn't mean that when you continually go back to that person who's harming you to be harmed over and over and over again. It doesn't mean that. But it does mean sometimes we do have to risk our spiritual, social, emotional, physical, whatever it is, safety. We have to put ourselves out there to offer the forgiveness that God asks us to. Now, the final C is community. Oftentimes, This is the school we were in Angola, and you can see the bullet holes still in the walls of the building. They rebuilt the school before they rebuilt the church by about 10 years, because the school served both the kids of the village and the kids out in the wilderness. And they thought that the best thing they could do is get these kids together, learning together and playing together. And that would build bridges not just now, but for the generations in the future. All right, so the last one is community. There are certain things that have to be done. I needed a picture of a bunch of people together, so I chose this one, because this is our staff team building day. Right before this story, there is another story that there's another story, this interaction that Jesus tells, and Jesus gives some pretty clear instructions. And he basically says, when one person has a problem with another person, and he says, what are you supposed to do? And there's two kind of striking things in that story that Jesus tells. One is, if you have a problem with somebody, if you have a challenge with somebody, if you need to offer somebody some correction or accountability or whatever it is, the first thing Jesus says is don't go alone, right? Take somebody with you, and allow that other person to bring somebody with them. We all deserve support. And the other thing that Jesus said, interestingly, is if you have another problem with other people, first go yourself, right? Don't involve the teacher or the boss or the pastor. You don't involve the pastor. It's okay. You can call me. Don't do that first. First, person to person, peer to peer, friend to friend, follower of Christ to follower of Christ. Have a conversation. Talk about what's going on. Use the community as part of it. In my previous life, when I was a software engineer, I used to work on small teams, and small teams would work together, and we worked together for about 6 months, and we would usually travel to various sites together. So these groups of people, for that time you were together, got very close, which was a very good thing, and we would hang out together. One time, we actually worked on a project where the only place they could put us all was in a conference room. So we all sat around in a conference room, all on our own little computers, doing our work, all in a circle around this conference room table. And after about 2 months of this, we noticed when we went to dinner together, if they sat us at a large table, we would all sit in the same places that we sat at the conference room table, despite the fact that my best friend was on this project, but he didn't sit next to me, he sit across from me. So even at dinner, we would sit across from each other, just like we did at the table. We get very close, right? Which is great until it isn't, right? It's great until there's that one guy on the team. Doesn't maybe seem like he wants to be on the team. You know, the one guy who kind of ruins the dynamic for everybody else. And I remember we had this project, and we had this one guy on this project. And we had a project manager over us, and we would all complain to the project manager about this guy, and he's like, there's nothing I can do. He's doing his work, yada, yada, yada. And after a while, the project manager looked at us, and he said, have you talked to him? Like, no. Why would we do that? He's like, well, because if I talk to him, he's going to think it's a disciplinary thing. If I talk to him, there's this whole other dynamic present. But if you talk to him as his friend, as his colleague, as his peer, that's different. So one day after we all broke up for the day, a couple of us decided that we were going to take this guy, who shall remain nameless, we were going to take him out for a beer. And we were just going to have a little bit. I know, don't be scandalized. I drank a beer. You know. We were going to take him out to a beer, and we were just going to talk, and we were going to kind of see. We were going to actually use all the other stuff. We were going to get curious. We were going to see what was going on. We were going to try to put ourselves in his shoes. We didn't have this language, right? And we were just going to put ourselves out there and see what happened. So we got together, and we had a really interesting conversation, and we discovered some things that we had in common. There was things that we enjoyed together, and then finally, towards the end of the evening, after more than one beer, we're like, so do you like working with us? He's like, oh yeah, I do. It's like, really? Because it's hard to tell some days. It kind of is. Because we like this team, and we like this project, and we like it, but it's kind of hard when it feels like there's somebody who's doesn't want to be here. And he's like, really? And it just went from there. And it wasn't that it was magic overnight, but even the next day, you could tell things were different. We had things to talk to him about. We learned what he was a fan of and how we can have conversations with him. And over time, he became more and more and more and more a part of the team, to the point when the project was over, he was probably one of the most heartbroken that our team was getting broken up and we were all being sent to different projects. Community, valuing community, using your community. We're not in this alone. It's part of why you are here, right? Is to remind us that we're not in this alone. We have each other, right? And that community, this village that we are a part of, is valuable and it's important and it brings life. So forgiveness is remembering that we have all already been forgiven, that we have all already tasted the grace that God has for us. We have all already been invited to put down the guilt and shame of things that we have done before. We have all already been invited to recognize that God closed that book and that we don't have to carry that debt. What we do have to do is close our books too. What we do have to do is forgive our neighbors as we have been forgiven. Because if we truly want to be forgiven, if we truly want to put all our burdens down, if we truly want to be free of the guilt and the shame, the only thing we have to do is be willing to free others. And in so doing, we will truly be Christ's followers. Amen.